Welcome to YO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Faith Barter, Assistant Professor of English and an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Black Studies Program, and the Center for the Study of Women in Society at the University of Oregon. Barter's research interests include African American literature, 19th century American literary studies, cultural studies, race and ethnicity, digital humanities, and legal history. Barter earned a law degree from American University in 2007 and a PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 2016. Barter's current book project is Black Pro Se, Authorship and the Limits of Law in 19th Century African American Literature. Thanks, Faith, so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's start with the typical question I always start with is, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I had a kind of previous life as a lawyer. I lived in DC for about 10 years and was working in law, politics, and policy. And had a pretty, as far as legal careers go, I was working on sort of sexy things. I was doing congressional investigations and just kind of knew at a point that that's not how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. I remembered that I had a professor in law school, Penny Pether, who had a specialty in law and literature. And I had studied English as an undergraduate, had always sort of entertained this thought of getting a graduate degree in English, and reached out to Penny to say, can you tell me a little bit more about this thing that you do? And do you think that it would be wildly foolish for me to do that? And to her real credit, she's since passed away. She's no longer with us, but she really took a lot of time to talk to me, help me kind of figure out, I really didn't know anything about academia. So my path sort of here is, a little bit less common, though there are some other former lawyers who are in academia as well. And yeah, that sort of began, I spent about a year just trying to figure out what I thought I might want to study and do. And that's sort of what started the path that brought me here.
So what led you to settle on the areas that you focus on?
Well, I knew that I wanted to continue working on law. I knew that I wanted to work on race and sort of formations and discourses of justice. And I went to Vanderbilt in large measure to work with Colin Dayan, who had just published her book, The Law is a White Dog, which was about legal rituals and personhood. And that felt very much like the sort of legal work that I wanted to do. And I didn't know what historical period I wanted to specialize in. I actually sort of assumed I would do contemporary literature. But my very first semester of graduate school, I took a class with Teresa Gadu on early African American print culture. And that was an incredibly serendipitous first graduate seminar for me to take, because in a sense I was sort of primed to see the legal connections already because I had just been in that world, but I was really surprised at how much legal discourse there was in the kind of popular media and press of the time. So we would never, no newspaper today would ever print the full text of a judicial opinion. No one would read it. It wouldn't be cost effective for presses to print it, but that, people regularly read the minutia of legal stuff in the 19th century, and particularly so in the Black press. And that was kind of it for me. Once I started to study 19th century African American literature and print culture, that just made all of the sense. It kind of brought everything together.
So that's a great lead into my next question. So let's talk about your monograph in progress, Black Pro Se, Authorship and the Limits of Law in 19th Century African American Lit. First, you've got a legal term in the title. So would you gloss that legal term for us?
I would be happy to. So the term pro se refers to pro se litigation. So this is the legal term that's used when someone represents themselves in court. And there's a really kind of common legal aphorism that says something like, the lawyer who represents themselves in court has a fool for a client. That which is, meant as a way of sort of gatekeeping lawyering as a domain of real specialization, craft, strategy, and so forth. And that term pro se also kind of coincidentally, if you put those two words together, makes the word prose, which is not etymologically sound whatsoever, but is sort of a happy coincidence. And so my book thinks about the ways that Black writers in the first half of the 19th century are mobilizing certain legal forms in their writing in really innovative and unexpected ways. That they're using forms like appeal or confession or jurisdictional attack or encryption, citation. And they're using those forms in ways that might kind of on the surface level look as though they are just conforming to existing legal structures. But of course, the legal structures in the 19th century are violently oppressive. And so Black writers are using those legal forms as ways of actually imagining other forms of belonging. And the book really kind of follows through how writers use each of these different legal forms. So that, for instance, David Walker publishes a pamphlet called Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And we might think of it as an appeal in the legal sense as a way of kind of seeking something from a higher legal authority. But when David Walker does this, the higher legal authority that he's speaking to is the colored citizens of the world of the title, which is a real reframing of the sort of judicial hierarchies that we might expect. And that kind of unsettling of existing legal structures is, in fact, commonplace in Black writing of the time. So we can find lots of examples of it from other works of literature as well.
So tell us who the authors are that you focus on in the book.
So David Walker is the kind of primary author I think about in the appeals chapter, but I'm also thinking about Victor Séjour, who wrote some of the earliest Black fiction. I also am thinking about Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in both the chapter on jurisdiction and the chapter on confession. I'm also thinking about a formerly enslaved writer who is known most commonly as James Williams, but who in fact kind of traveled under and embodied several different personae. Nat Turner, Confessions of Nat Turner, thinking about the ways that he uses confession. And then I'm also spending most of my chapter on encryption thinking about the novel The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Krantz, which was a text that was only kind of fairly recently discovered. And for a number of years, it was kind of not clear if it was autobiography, if it was fiction. And those questions about sort of what is nonfiction and what is fiction is one of the questions that has sort of, that surfaces a lot around 19th century Black literature.
Totally fascinating project. And I know that on the strength of the book project, you were awarded a fellowship to Penn State University Center for American Literary Studies First Book Institute. Mm-hmm. So tell us, what is a First Book Institute and how did it help you?
So the First Book Institute was a fantastic experience that I was very fortunate to participate in. It's the sort of brainchild of Sean Gowdy at Penn State and Priscilla Walt at Duke. And they put together this summer institute where, junior scholars who are working on their first book come together as part of a cohort. I think there were 8 people in my cohort, and spend a week together in the summer presenting work, hearing each other's work, workshopping chapters and book proposals, and also connecting with mentors in field and hearing from other scholars who've recently published first books. And that's normally in person. COVID had just sort of struck the year that I participated in, so it was virtual, but I had a really wonderful cohort. I just had a Zoom a couple of days ago with a few of them. We're regularly in touch, and they've become really valuable interlocutors for me.
Wonderful. So it's very clear from everything you've said so far that your interest and expertise in law and legal scholarship is crucial to your scholarship as a literary scholar and to your identity as a literary scholar. Why is taking such an approach to especially African American lit so valuable?
So there are a few reasons for this. One is that kind of as a field, law and literature has been, we might say, slow to broaden its canon. And that's one of the things that I really want to push that field in. But also, this really matters because the writers themselves are using and are so deeply conversant in legal language and legal imagination. And so, really, I'm just taking the writers, I'm taking what they are doing and taking that seriously. So, a lot of kind of scholarly attention to Black writing, in particularly in the first half of the 19th century, has really, to the extent that it's engaged with legal theory, has thought about that writing as a form of testimony, has positioned those writers as witnesses to the violence that was being carried out against them. And that's a hugely important piece of what's happening, but it also has its limitations. So if we are solely focused on the ways that these writers are witnessing and describing their own experience, we are missing all of the really creative, innovative, imaginative ways that they are not just documenting events that have happened, but they are really engaged in a project of world making, of revisioning existing structures, and they're shaping discourse around nation formation and different forms of belonging. So it's the writers themselves who are actually doing this this work, and so that, I think, is why it's really important to bring that kind of legal context to the work that those writers are doing.
So now that Black Prose is nearing completion, and I also know that you have a number of other works in progress, would
Mhm.
you tell us about one of those?
Sure. So I just finished an article that kind of bridges 19th century Black literature and more contemporary forms of Black culture. So in that article, I'm thinking about the relationship between Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is a narrative of her enslavement and self-emancipation. And for those who have not read the text, she is most famous perhaps for having spent 7 years confined to a very small garret space above her grandmother's cottage in hiding before she eventually kind of made her way north. And she refers to that space as a loophole of retreat. And I'm thinking about that text alongside, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, the 2019 film, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which follows really a kind of pair of friends, Black men in contemporary San Francisco, 21st century San Francisco, who become squatters in what used to be the family home of the kind of main character. And so in both of these texts, we have what is a sort of illicit occupation of a family home from which they have been dispossessed and cut off through enslavement and sort of gentrification and afterlives of slavery in the 21st century context. So I'm thinking about the ways that, thinking through Harriet Jacobs and the ways that she's balancing privacy and thinking about her loophole of retreat as both a kind of space that she's entitled to occupy and a space that affords her certain forms of privacy that are not available to her elsewhere. Along how that reading of that text kind of helps us think about the ways that the two characters in The Last Black Man in San Francisco are occupying that family home.
Can you say a little bit more in general terms about the value of studying 19th century Black literature in the 21st century?
Yes. So the first kind of response to that is a sort of somber and dystopian one, which is that literature continues to be pressing and urgent in our current moment. And the sort of, there's an experience that often my students have when they're coming to that literature of that period for the first time, where they are really genuinely surprised in a lot of cases at how relevant the discourse is to things that are currently happening. On the flip side of that, I think that there's also something really exciting about the ways that Black writers in the 19th century are also engaged in practices of things that in our current context we might think of as Afrofuturism. The ways that they're envisioning like radical possibilities for the future, envisioning forms of Black joy and belonging and pleasure. And so I think we have those kind of both of those ways that the writing from the 19th century feels really relevant and pressing in ways that are both sobering and exciting.
So another crucial aspect of your work is your work in the digital humanities. So how did you get involved with DH?
By happenstance, I have to say. So shortly after I started here at UO, I was talking to a colleague in the English department, Heidi Kaufman, who is a Victorianist and had done some work on some rebellions in the Caribbean in the 19th century. And we just started talking about this and talking about some of the challenges of researching, particularly some of the print culture and media around those events in the 19th century. For a few reasons. Archives are really kind of diffuse. Sometimes events that happen, let's say in the Caribbean, get written about and published about 20 years later in a kind of African American newspaper, becomes very difficult to know where you should be looking for discourse about rebellions in the kind of Atlantic African diaspora at that time period. And so we started talking about this, talked to Leslie Alexander, who at the time was a colleague in the history department, does a lot of really exciting work on the Haitian Revolution. And she got involved, and then Heidi very resourcefully had connected with several other faculty from data science here at UO. And we put together a proposal for Rebellions in the African Diaspora project, which began as a way of trying to think about how we can create digital tools that will help us map the travel of discourse about rebellions and where that discourse is taking place, how it's circulating throughout the diaspora. And I think, and this is largely, Heidi has really done a huge amount of work on this project over the past couple of years. She's also brought in Eric Steiner from Stanford. And I think we're kind of now in a direction where we're leaning toward creating a sort of transcription-based project. So we're thinking about how to get primary sources from archives all over the place in ways that we can make them available. Transcription turns out to be one of the kind of most pressing needs for those materials, which are difficult to put one's hands on. They often have, if they have been digitized, they may have been OCR'd, but often it's really not usable OCR. And so here we get to the limits of like machine-based technology, and it turns out there's a real need for human transcription. So that's kind of the direction that we're currently, I think, moving toward.
So I know that this new aspect of your identity as a digital humanist has recently informed your teaching. Mm-hmm. So tell us about how you use DH in the classroom.
Yes, so I teach a course called Black Rebellions, which is kind of tied in with the work that I'm doing on this DH project. And I've taught it twice now. The first time I taught it, the component of the course was this kind of class digital site. So we built a site, and each of the students, and it was a hybrid course, so undergraduates and graduate students, And over the course of the term, we did a lot of work to theorize rebellion, to critique some of the discourse around rebellion, to destabilize some of that terminology. And each student had to conceive of a digital project, a kind of digital exhibit that they would make to include on this site. And they also had to, as a class, conceive of a sort of theme or framework for the site that would kind of hold all of these things together. So the class settled on the concept of fragmented rebellions because in the course of doing this work, we spent a lot of time talking about the gaps that exist in archives, the reason that those gaps exist, and really resisting the urge to try to explain or fill in things that have been erased or lost to history that simply cannot be recovered. So balancing the work of doing sort of recovery archival work while acknowledging the limits of that and the kind of colonial impulse that we don't want to bring to archives. And I had a wonderful GE, Xander Tan. I want to make sure to name him and give him credit. He helped set up the site and helped work with the students in coordinating the kind of collection of all of their things. So they did story maps, they did collages. Some of them did projects that kind of looked more a little bit like traditional projects, but in a digital environment. They did timelines. They pulled sources from the archive and reimagined them, adapted them into fine art projects. So I had a student who did illustrations of a rebellion that she found and then burned away part of the paper to kind of signify the gaps and the sort of violent ways that some of these histories get interrupted. So it was a really beautiful project. There's a mission state, the site still exists. I'm not sure if you're able to like put a link to it anywhere, but I'm really, really proud of the work that the students did. And it was a really exciting testament to how possible it is to do innovative DH work within the quarter system, which does not give us that much time in an individual course. So it was a really wonderful experience.
So you are, my introduction indicated, we've talked about you. You are a scholar of literature and the law. You are a scholar of African American literature and the law, but you're also a scholar of gender and feminist jurisprudence. So tell us a little bit about that aspect of your work.
Sure. So I would say I can separate this into sort of two general categories. One is that I would say it has to do with methodology. So one of the kind of ways that this matters to my work is that I'm using many of the tools, the frameworks that Black feminist scholars have developed over decades to bring as a kind of method of critique. And that includes, it extends beyond sort of looking at the role of women in these texts, but it also has to do with the ways that I'm thinking about, for instance, like citational practice, the ways that I'm thinking about the kind of unseen or unspoken multiple audiences that some of these texts are speaking to. And so there's that kind of methodological component. And then there's also the ways that I'm always wanting my work to be attentive to women's labor, women's contributions to these literary histories. That matters especially, I think, in the rebellions work. And that course has actually really, it's always had a sort of Black feminist ethic, and that's become even more prominent as I've continued to teach it, because in the case of rebellions in particular, women's labor has been subject to all sorts of kind of second order forms of erasure as well. Despite the fact that there's also a rich tradition of people like Angela Davis and the Combahee River Collective speaking to Black women's revolutionary labor and potential. So it really is sort of those two things, the methodology and the content.
So another aspect of your identity and your activities are that you service is important to what you do. So you serve part of the Center for the Study of Women's Society at the U of O. And you're also on the steering committee of the Black Studies program at U of O. Why is that an important part of what you do?
It's really inextricable from the work itself. So the project of doing any Black studies work, and I think especially Black feminist work, is it's a project that that you don't sort of leave in your campus office. It's a way of seeing and being in the world. And particularly as a white woman entering that space, which is not always for me, I'm not always invited to, it's not always appropriate for me to be in. I think of that as a really serious and sacred privilege that has been extended to me, that I'm able to do this work. And it's something that really motivates everything about the way that I see the world, the way that I strive to take up space in the world, the kinds of conversations that I want to be in, while also acknowledging the limits of my own positionality and subjectivity in those spaces.
So we're coming to the end of our time. Probably only one or two questions left, but the next one is, what attracted you to the University of Oregon?
Well, there are many ways to answer that question. I want to say, first, it was very exciting to me when I initially applied for this job, that the job was specifically earmarked as a 19th century position, which is really, really important for a whole lot of reasons. It's very common in Black studies and African American literary studies for positions to be advertised that are not period specific, which has sort of, benefits and drawbacks. But it was very exciting to me to know that I was entering a space that was specifically being imagined for someone working in the 19th century. And so that was really exciting. It signaled really great things to me about the clarity of the vision that the department had for this program. And I knew that I would be entering a space where specifically my work in the 19th century was valued and was, intentional. And then also, this is a really beautiful place. I'm from Maine. I'm from a place in Maine that's in a valley about an hour from the coast. There's a lot about Oregon as a place that feels very familiar to me. And I feel very, very fortunate. The academic job market does not really afford one a lot of choices, it often feels like, about where one lives. And people often feel like they have to make really serious sacrifices to take a job and do the kind of work they want to do. And it did not feel, the sacrifice was that I'm separated from my entire extended family and partner, but it did not feel, in terms of a place to live and do work, that was a sacrifice, and that felt like a huge gift for an academic in these times.
Well, it's a huge gift to have you with us here at the University of Oregon. Final question. Do you have a book by an African-American writer of the 19th century or the 20th century that you would recommend to our viewers and listeners?
Ooh, just one?
Well, you can give more than one.
Okay, so I will say, in terms of 19th century texts, it's probably already been pretty clear how important Harriet Jacobs's text is to me, but I would also kind of append Blake, Martin Delaney's novel Blake, which I think is another one of those texts. It's sort of epic and intricate and strange and Afrofuturist in sort of unexpected ways. And that's one that I think it's complicated, so it's often kind of understudied and underread, that I think is a really excellent sort of text for people maybe who are less well versed in 19th century stuff. I will say, in terms of contemporary texts, there's a text that I've taught a couple of times now. Well, I'll do two 21st century texts as well. I'm sort of cheating, but I'm going to do it anyway. So there are two texts that I've taught in a course that I teach on sort of discourses of the supernatural. And I found them to be very, very affecting texts for me personally, and really provocative. One is M Archive by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which is a kind of experimental text that's a kind of collection of lab notes and fragments of a reimagined periodic table of elements in a kind of post-apocalyptic world. It's also a kind of homage to M. Jackie Alexander, iconic Black feminist scholar. And the other text is August Town by Kai Miller. Very different text, novel. That one I won't even say any more about because you just need to experience it as a reader.
Well, thank you, Faith, for those recommendations. And also thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Paul.
I've been speaking with Faith Barter, Assistant Professor of English and an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Black Studies Program, and the Center for the Study of Women in Society at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.